Hi, I'm Evan Snook. I will be discussing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system and social and political changes that have been made to eliminate this. So, historical background. So, racial inequality in the criminal justice system has deep roots in American history. This is not something that has developed recently. This is something that has been developing for a long time. After slavery, laws such as poll taxes, lottery tests, and felony voting restrictions were used to limit Black political power. Some of the country's early drug laws were influenced by fears and stereotypes about racial and ethnic groups. The war on drugs in the 1980s led to a major increase in drug arrests and incarcerations, and this will be shown later in the disparities between the different forms of cocaine and different sentencing and between like black and white people, and inequalities from the past still affect things like housing, education, employment, and criminal justice today. So, racial inequality in policing. Black Americans are stopped and searched by police more often than any other racial groups. And this is proven statistically. In New York, Black residents were about 25% of the population, but made up about 55% of people stopped each year from 2004 to 2012, while white residents were about 33% of the population, but only about 10% of people stopped. And also in New York, about two-thirds of people stopped and searched in 1998 to 1999 were Black or Latino. So these statistics really show that it's not equal who's being stopped or, these situations. It's statistically shown that um, people of color are stopped more frequently. So these types of interactions and statistics make it harder for communities to trust the police. Arrest disparities, racial differences can be seen in arrest as well as other parts of the justice system. African Americans made up 35% of people arrested for drug possession. They also made up 55% of drug possession convictions and 74% of people imprisoned for drug possession. Black youth were incarcerated at about 25 times the rate of white youth. And so a big reason for that is if these Black youths are growing up in communities of poverty, that it's shown statistically that there's a higher rate that they will be involved in gangs and drugs, to just find protection or a source of family. And researchers point to things like racial profiling, unequal enforcement, poverty, and neighborhoods condition as possible factors. So incarceration rates. The US prison population grew from about 200,000 people in 1970 to about 2.2 million in 2017. And Black Americans made up 37.5% of the prison population in 2020, while making up about 13% of the US population. So this number here shows a big difference, like disproportional. So Black Americans were incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. The war on drugs was one of the biggest reasons incarceration increased so dramatically. And incarceration can affect entire families by separating parents from children and making it harder to find jobs and housing. So in a family, if the dad or mom or whatever the situation is incarcerated, then that takes away a source of income to that family, and then it furthers puts that family that could have already been facing poverty and deeper poverty, which increases the rates of, gangs and drugs as a source of income. So social causes, poverty can make people more vulnerable to getting involved in the criminal justice system. Limited access to good schools can also make it harder for people to find stable careers. The book reports that only 72% of Black students graduate from high school. And in some poor communities, a lack of job opportunities has made drug dealing seem like a way to make money. So, in these schools of poverty, these schools receive less tax money from the people. And so that means the school is already receiving less money, which in turn they can provide less opportunities for the student because they don't have enough money to support the students and set up programs for these students. So racial inequality in criminal justice is connected to larger issues involving education, income, neighborhoods, and public health. So political responses. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 reduced the crack to powder cocaine sentencing difference from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. Was a very good jump here, but it's still not equal. And so this shows like black people were much more likely to use a certain form of cocaine as compared to white people. So what they did is um the form black people more likely used had a much higher sentence that you would receive as opposed to the other form. And the law also removed the mandatory minimum sentence for simple crack cocaine possession. The First Step Act later continued some of these reforms and added other changes to the prison system. The National Academies recommends continuing to look at sentence reforms that could further reduce these racial disparities. Other possible reforms include reviewing long prison sentences and reducing incarceration for like technical violations of supervision. So community and social responses, communities have organized to push back against racial inequality in policing and in the justice system. And activists in New York use protest legislation and other efforts to to challenge stop and frisk, which is basically when like you'll be stopped or like searched or harassed in some way by the police that are like suspicious. So Black Lives Matter became one of the most well-known movements fighting against racial injustice and police violence. And a big part of this was social media because these police violence and other racial inequalities could finally be shown to the world and shown what's truly happening. And this really fueled the flame under this. So, community programs that focus on preventing violence and improving police accountability are being encouraged and studied. Challenges and criticisms. Criminal justice reform has to find a balance between reducing inequality and also keeping communities safe. Some reforms have helped reduce racial disparities, including changes to the crack and powder cocaine sentencing. However, the act still left an 18 to 1 difference between these two, which obviously is still not equal. So, racial differences in incarceration have gone down over the past few decades, but they have not disappeared. So, researchers argue that changing the justice system alone is not enough. Society needs to come along with these changes and see equality across the board. Future directions, police stops and searches could be reduced to help limit unnecessary contact with the justice system. Communities could expand programs that focus on preventing violence before this happens. This could also involve reaching out to the youth and youth programs to keep the youth out of gangs and out of violence and out of drugs. Better transparency and accountability could help address racial differences in policing. Government policies could also help focus more on problems like poverty, education, housing, and public health, which are the most root causes to a lot of these problems. And continued sentence reform and second look policies could help reduce unnecessarily long periods of incarceration. So, in conclusion, racial disparities are still present in police arrest, incarcerations, and other parts of the justice system. And Black Americans continue to be disproportionately represented in the police population or in the prison population. And this is statistically proven across the board. And problems with education, employment, housing, and economic opportunity are at the root of these problems because people struggle to find a way out and they resort to things that get them in situations where they end up in prison when they're just trying to provide for their families. So reforms such as sentence changing, community programs, and greater police accountability are attempts to address these problems. So, addressing racial inequality requires understanding both where these problems came from and what can be done to improve the system in the future to reduce racial inequality in the justice system. Thank you.